Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
The Heart of Hospice podcast is being sponsored by The Death Deck, featuring the End of Life Deck. The End of Life Deck is used by many healthcare providers as a casual way to help start conversations about end-of-life wishes. It helps people communicate what matters most to them. To learn more about the EOL deck, visit thedeathdeck.com. This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being brought to you by GrandPad. This holiday season, give the gift of connection with GrandPad. GrandPad is the all-in-one tablet designed specifically for seniors. This Christmas, give the gift that keeps on giving, a world where no senior feels lonely or isolated. GrandPad is more than a gift, it's a gateway to cherished family memories. To learn more about GrandPad, visit grandpad.net/THOH. GrandPad, bringing families together.
Susan Combs is my guest today. We're talking about her caregiving experience with her dad and how her organization, Pancakes for Roger, was born out of her dad's request for pancakes while he was coming to the end of his life with Agent Orange-related throat cancer. Susan Combs is the founder of Pancakes for Roger, a nonprofit dedicated to serving the veterans who have served our nation, and she does that by asking folks to enjoy a simple pleasure in life, eating pancakes. Here's her story. Susan was extraordinarily close to her father, Major General Roger Combs, a Vietnam War veteran who was diagnosed with throat cancer due to Agent Orange exposure and had to be put on a feeding tube. Susan was his caregiver, and one morning he expressed a simple wish. He wanted to have pancakes for breakfast, but he couldn't due to his physical condition and limitations. After Major General Combs' death, his family had a pancake breakfast in his memory. Susan decided that she would create a movement to honor and give back to the brave men and women that serve our country. What started as a grassroots movement led to a best-selling book and eventually to the formation of Pancakes for Roger into a nonprofit organization. For every pancake picture posted or tagged on social media with hashtag Pancakes for Roger, the nonprofit makes a donation in Major General Combs' name to the Veterans Clinic at the University of Missouri in his hometown. The Veterans Clinic has assisted more than 1,600 veterans and recovered $14 million in VA benefits for their clients. You're going to love this fantastic story. Susan is going to share the story of her dad, Major General Roger Combs, and his end-of-life journey and her caregiving journey with him. She says that she learned from that experience how to have hard conversations, and she shares the relationship between the two of them and how it impacted her as a caregiver. Susan also talks about her self-care habits and how that was such an important part of her time as a caregiver. And she also offers some great advice to other caregivers who might be experiencing the same thing. Susan shared how she created the nonprofit Pancakes for Roger. This is a story of legacy and creating meaning for anyone who's caring for a military veteran. So I want you to stay connected, stay with us to hear Susan share her story. There's a lot to learn. Susan, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. I'm so glad to have you with me.
Thanks so much, Helen.
We've already had a fantastic chat, and fortunately, we did not record it because we got very real very fast. But it's great to have you with me. We're going to be talking about your dad, who was a force, and I want you to introduce me and my listeners to your dad and share his story.
Oof. So my dad was a giant, even though his stature was about 5'10". He was a major general in the Air Force. He was a civilian judge. He was a church board member. He was, an uncle, a grandfather, an advisor, a Joint Chiefs of Staff member. I mean, he was a good guy, but he was one of those guys that he was good when no one was watching. So my father always had a philanthropic heart. He was always somebody that was there to give you help when you needed it and also give you the kick in the ass when you needed that too. But he was just one of those guys that very much walked the walk and talked the talk. Military thing is WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. And my dad was very much that way. And so, he gave me a lot of great life lessons along the way that I'm very fortunate to have because I had a great father. I know not everybody did. So I always try to be sensitive to that. But, he was a good one for sure.
Awesome. So you had a caregiving experience with your dad. Your dad had throat cancer related to Agent Orange exposure.
Correct.
Tell me about your dad's diagnosis and how things moved with him.
So my father was diagnosed with Agent Orange related throat cancer in 2008, and we had 10 relatively good years. He had, pretty drastic surgery and things like that, and chemo and radiation. He was treated at the Mayo Clinic. However, at the last year of his life, he relapsed twice. And on the second relapse, we knew it was kind of the beginning of the end. And we knew the cancer had come back around in June, and then he actually passed away in August of that same year in 2018. We were fortunate enough to have hospice at home. I know not everybody does. My father was an early adapter of long-term care insurance, through the military, and that provided us to be able to have that care at home and also, utilize family members as well as professional staff. And, with the hospice, I think a lot of times with hospice, people get a negative connotation.
Sure.
They think that, okay, when we call in hospice, somebody's kicking it in a couple of days, and they don't realize that the hospice is care for the entire family. And it's basically when you say like, hey, I'm not going to have any of the more medical intervention. Because let's be honest here, especially with cancer, a lot of times they're having to poison you to kill the cancer. And my father was a very big believer in you have to navigate the quality of life with the care. And once the quality of life drastically reduces so much that the care just isn't worth it anymore, then it was time to make a change for sure.
What did quality of life mean for your dad? How did he define that?
My father, the last year of his life, he was on oxygen and he was also had a feeding tube. Before that, for a lot of families, eating is everything. Sitting around the table, enjoying meals and things like that, especially, my dad grew up on a dairy farm. He used to say, I grew up on a dairy farm, everything else is easy. And so food was very much in the center of our family, but my father was also a military man. And so when he was told like, hey, you're going to get your nutrition through a feeding tube, he accepted that. So that wasn't something that he ever kind of fought against or anything, but it was definitely, it did change the dynamics of the family in terms of that was no longer the center. Because I think a lot of times when families come together for holidays and stuff like that, you're sharing stories, you're sharing meals. And that was a shift, I would say, definitely within our family. But my niece Josie was born. She was alive the last year of my father's life. And so that was his duty when we would eat as a family, is he would hold the baby, and he would have the baby while we were having meals. And so when we got to a point where it was time for hospice, it was definitely a joint family conversation. My dad didn't make a proclamation saying this is what he was going to do. We didn't say as a family, like, hey, it's time, this is too much. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, and my dad made a statement. He said, it hurts so much because we've loved so much. And I don't know any other way, and I wouldn't want to know any other way. But when he said that, it was just, we knew it was time, and we wanted him to be as comfortable as possible. But we also knew it was important to give my mother the support that you can get with hospice through the social workers and the caregivers that can give her a little bit of a break. And then I was fortunate enough with my professional life, since I own my own company. I created my company when I was 26. And I always said that as long as you have your computer and your phone, you should be able to work wherever. And I think a lot of times in our lives, we don't realize that the decisions that we make at the time can impact such a major thing in our lives decades later. And so since I set up my company that way, I was able to help care for my father and return home before we put him on hospice, and be one of his primary caregivers during that time.
So feeding tubes are a lot of times a really controversial decision for someone experiencing a serious illness and for their caregivers, right? For their village that's around them. Did your dad struggle with the decision? Because, so let's be clear, and just for my listeners, you're talking about what we call a G tube that's inserted surgically into the stomach from the outside. So he literally had a tube through which liquid was pushed, and it went straight into his stomach. Did your dad struggle with like his body image or anything from the effects of having the G tube?
No, I mean, no, because again, my dad was military. Like, you tell him what the task is, you tell him what the situation is, and he's like, nothing can change this, so I'm going to accept it. So my father was one of those that didn't really fight it. I will tell you that, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners have experienced, when somebody's on oxygen, if the oxygen levels go low and there's some oxygen deprivation, there can be a lot of confusion. And so I do remember a specific incident that it was the only time I was afraid during the caregiving process, because he got confused and he was trying to pull his tube out.
Yeah.
And I remember standing at the kitchen sink, and I grabbed his hands and I was like, Dad, if you do that, we're done. We're done here. Like, because we had a DNR, he was on hospice. And it was so frightening to get him to just stop. And, it passed in his, because as I know, but when somebody's brain starts getting active again, then usually the oxygen levels can kind of come back in, or, at least it was that way with my father. And so he kind of realized it pretty quick, and he understood. But, there was, with the feeding tube and things like that, I mean, the only thing a couple of things I remember him doing is I remember us going to Christmas at my cousin's house, and his clock was winding down. I mean, he was tired. And so I remember him putting coffee in his feeding tube to give him that jolt of caffeine.
Yeah, you can push any liquid through a feeding tube.
Oh, he put whiskey in there.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, but the biggest thing for him, and the only complaint he ever made, was it bothered his stomach if the formula was cold. So my dad was very specific: 14 seconds in the microwave. Not 13, not 15. The general would know it had to be heated up for 14 seconds. So that was the thing that he found was kind of the sweet spot to be easier and more gentle on his stomach.
So that story about his pulling on the G-tube is a big deal. It's not something we've talked about on the podcast before, but I have been with patients and their caregivers that, that's their only form of nutrition. And if that thing comes out, there's an unspoken decision that they won't try to reinsert or put a new one in, that they would let nature take its course at that point. And that is a huge, scary thing in a lot of people's minds.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. So, for you as a caregiver, how would you describe your caregiving style?
So my father and I were cut from the same cloth. My dad always said we had two type A's in the family, and that was him and me. And so my father, I treated him more like a person than a patient. And my brother's a nurse. And so my brother was an oncology nurse for a number of years, and he was actually a hospice nurse after that. But my dad preferred me because I always brought in the logic. And everybody's different. But my dad, I mean, my mom's an emotional person. She kills me sometimes because I'm like, I'm not so emotional, I'm more logical. But with him, he preferred me because he and I understood him, and I spoke to him how I would want to be spoken to. And so, I mean, just one story that I remember, my mother was going to have some doctor's appointments and also needed to take like the dog to the groomer or something like that. And I had come back to New York for a few days for some meetings, and she said, I need you to kind of come back and help me with this. And this was before he was on a hospice, but things were kind of winding down. And I remember like talking to my dad on the phone, and he was kind of indignant, and he said, I don't know why you have to come home. He was just like, I'm fine. And I said, you know what, Dad, this isn't about you. This is about Mom. Because I said, you know what? You're probably right. Could you be left alone? Yeah, probably. And probably everything's okay. But I said, it's the one time that you may trip and fall and hit your head and maybe pass away. I said, she would never forgive herself.
Yeah.
And I said, so this isn't about you. This is about her. And he said, okay. So it just, so I had that way with my dad that I could just kind of bottom line it and say, this is what we're looking at. I mean, my dad was a strategic planner. He was a long range expert for the military. Like, he understood that. So it's just like by going by logic. But again, you got to know what makes the person tick that you're doing the caregiving for, because a conversation like that would never work on my mother. My mother, I would have to go by with emotion. I would have to stroke her ego. I'd have to eventually make her think it was her idea. And then I could get her on board. Because then she would think it was her idea. And I was like, okay, fine. I don't need credit. Let's just do it. But those are the things that I think are important, that at caregiving, you have to assess the situation and understand what you're dealing with. And that can be different from day to day, as you know.
Well, the communication style alone is huge, because there are a lot of people that can't receive that upfront, practical, here's how it is advice.
Yeah.
So here's another thing. Boundaries are a big deal when it comes to caregiving, and you have to say no to things you don't have time for, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we forget to tell caregivers, you have to set boundaries with your person, the person who's experiencing the illness. There is nothing wrong, and it's very healthy to do that, to set a boundary. You just told your dad, this one's not about you. This decision is being made for somebody else. You need to go along with it because this is what's best for us.
Yep.
Yeah, not everybody can hear that, but that's a really good point. So you had a very connected communication style with your dad, which thank goodness you had similar communication styles, because that would be different. Did you do a lot of hands-on with your dad? Did he allow the physical assistance as the daughter?
Yeah. So since my brother was a nurse, and I will say that my brother is a cancer survivor. My brother is the longest surviving bone marrow transplant performed at St. Jude Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And so in a lot of ways, it was a way for my brother to give back to my dad, because my dad gave so much to Matt. I mean, Matt had a 16% chance of survival. I mean, this was leukemia in the late 80s, early 90s, where it was basically death sentence. And so my brother did a lot of those things. Again, we had hospice. So we had that type of stuff. But when it came to like bathing and things like that, my dad did all right. And then my brother would help him with that stuff, because you want somebody to preserve their dignity as much as possible. Right. And my mother helped. My mother helped too. But like, I took care of the tube feedings. I mean, and I'll tell you, like, I'm the finance person. So I was the one that the last year of my father's life, he and I sat down and I spreadsheeted everything. And I mean, I asked who the plumber was, who's the electrician, who's the accountant, who do I sell the guns to, who do I call for the military pension, who do I sell the Winnebago to, who do I talk to for the farm stuff, all the passwords. I mean, I have all that stuff. What he wanted on his headstone at Arlington. I mean, I have all that stuff. And so we sat down the first time and did that because he was getting ready for another surgery and we didn't know if he was going to be able to speak after that. And then he and I sat down again and just kind of clarified some things. And I will tell you, that is hard. That is hard as a caregiver. And sometimes you have to be brave enough to ask the questions that you may not be ready for the answers.
So not the password parts of things. You're talking about asking, where will you be buried? Yeah. What do you want on your headstone?
Yeah. I mean, and I'll tell you, I think the hardest questions I ever asked for my father. So, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and I work as an expert witness on medical malpractice cases all across the country. And my father was treated at the Mayo Clinic, but after he relapsed once, he wanted to get a second opinion at MD Anderson. And through my connections and the work that I do, I was able to get him into the head of the head and neck cancer department. And, my father also had a really good way about him when he would speak to doctors. And he would say, it's the practice of medicine. It's the practice of medicine. And he's like, you're not all knowing. You're not God. You're not, I don't expect you to know anything, or everything rather. But you could see the medical personnel just kind of let down a little bit, where they just felt like, because we live in such a litigious country. I mean, let's be honest here. But I remember my dad went to a PET scan because I actually was on trial, or I had a trial that I was participating in Texas. And then I went and met my mother and him for the second opinion at MD Anderson. And he had his PET scan. And then I met him for this PET scan, and we walked back to the hotel. And I don't know how I got the courage, but I knew I needed to ask him, because I think a lot of times when people say they have regrets, it's over things that they didn't say.
Yes.
And information they didn't get. And I said to him, do you want to keep fighting? And he said, you know what? I want to try one more time. He said, I want to do it for me, and I want to do it for our family. And I said, okay. I said, but you've been sick for 10 years. And I said, it is your body. And I said, it is your battle. And I said, at any given time, if it just gets to be too much and you want to tap out, I said, there's nothing wrong with that. And I said, but you just have to tell one of us. So it was, I mean, I was in my 30s when I lost my dad. And so it was like, I didn't have any friends to give me the play-by-play in the notebook, because all my friends, to this day, most of their fathers are still alive.
Yeah.
And so and that's one of the things that I think people don't understand is, like, when you join this club that you never want to join, the people that come out of the woodwork and support you are the people that you least expect. These are other people that are in the club. And so they're the ones that know the right words to say and know the right things to say, hey, don't forget about this. You might want to think about that. And so having that conversation with my dad, it gave me peace of mind to let him know it was okay. Because I know with hospice, you and I were talking about, there's a book called Midwife for the Souls. And a lot of times people hang on because there's something that's unresolved. So, I wanted to make sure to give my dad as much peace of mind with those things as I possibly could, so that he could relax. And if it was his time to cross over, it was his time to cross over.
Yeah. Not to give him permission, but to validate and recognize this is your decision. You decide where things stop and start, which is a huge, huge gift to someone with a serious illness, because so much of what's happening to them is completely out of their control.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Eventually the disease process is driving the bus.
Yep.
And everybody gets to be along for the ride, and it's not easy. So you gave your dad a really, I don't want to say a gift, but you gave him something that day by communicating that directly with him. That's an important thing. So when you think about how you supported your dad during the last few years when things were so intense, and especially those last few months, what did you get right as a caregiver?
I've never been asked that question. I got a lot of stuff right. Because I had a good dad. I think, uh, damn it, Helen. um, I think in, I think in every family you have somebody when they're the head of the family and their time is winding down. There is somebody in that family that has to step into that role. And it was inevitable when I was 10 years old, that was going to be my role. And so I think my entire life, my dad kind of groomed me. And to know how to make decisions, to know how to think quick on my feet, to bring in the logic, bring in the emotion when I need to know who to go to. I mean, my dad also taught me it's important, I got to be smart enough to know what I know, but smarter enough to know what I don't know. And so it never was a kick to my ego when I didn't know something and I had to tap somebody in. And, with my dad and I, and also like that, I'll tell you that book, I know I keep coming back to that book, that Midwife for the Souls, but that taught me a lot of some of the certain things to say to him to make him feel comfortable. And, one of the things that is probably one of my best last memories with him is, we have 2 farms back in Missouri. And, my father always did sharecropping with the gentleman, I mean, my entire life. And so he had Larry Sladen come over to the house and just walk me through a lot of farm stuff. And so I would understand some of the decisions that he knew I would have to make. And when I walked Larry out, he said, Susan, you need to take your dad to the farm. He said, it's in his soul. He was like, he said he needs to go and just spend some time. And so it was a Friday afternoon, and in New York, it's customary to do summer Fridays, which means like closing the offices at 1:00. And so I was in Missouri, and my mom was gone, and I looked at my dad and I said, want to go for a ride? I said, do you want to go to the farm? And he was just like, oh, we don't have to do that. And I said, why not? I said, where you got to be? And he was just like, nowhere. I mean, he was at home, he couldn't go anywhere. And I said, why? Let's go. And so we got into the pickup truck, and, our family farm 6 miles away from town. We drove out there and we drove the entire property. And my dad just kept saying, this is fun. This is just so much fun. And he was talking to me about like where the spring is, like, about some of the land and, some of our land that's in conservation program and stuff like that. And then at the end, we were getting ready to leave, and he's like, 1 minute. And I was like, okay. And he gets out of the pickup truck. And then like 3 minutes later, he gets back in. He's like, I can't come to the farm and not pee.
I knew it. I knew the minute you started, that's what he was marking his territory one last time.
Yeah, exactly. So it just, so I'm so happy that I have, and I will tell you that I never say I have any regrets, because I think if you say you have regrets, you're denying yourself the place in the world right now. And I know I was a good daughter. I know I showed up. I mean, when my father was diagnosed with throat cancer the first time, I had a dear friend that's no longer here that said to me, he said, Susan, you'll never regret the time you spend. He said, a lot of times he said, you never hear somebody say, oh, well, I wish I didn't spend that much, that afternoon with Helen. That was a real waste of my time. He said, you always say, yeah, you always say, you know what? I wish I had more time with Helen. So it was something that I took to heart. I mean, I was what, 28 when he was diagnosed. And so I had newly started company from 26, and I was nervous about being gone and trying to, because it was a company of one, and I was still trying to figure things out, but I was so glad that I showed up. And so I know that I was a good daughter, and and we had those conversations and we talked through everything, with the exception of one thing. And so it's just, I can hear him in my head still to this day. And then he's also left me several mentors. There's a lot of men in my life that were dear friends of my father's that I can call at any given time and say, hey, I need to talk this through. What do you think Dad would think? And so he gave me the ability to know where to go when I need to.
I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
The Death Deck now has another tool for families, caregivers, and healthcare providers to use. It's called the End of Life Deck. Just like the Death Deck, the End of Life Deck uses multiple choice and open-ended questions to facilitate conversations about end-of-life wishes. Certified hospice and palliative care nurse Helen Bauer shares why she uses the EOL deck.
As a hospice nurse, I've seen the challenges people experience when trying to communicate their end-of-life wishes to family and friends. The EOL deck is the perfect blend of humor and reflection, making discussions about final wishes less painful and even a little fun.
The EOL deck can be used by social workers, chaplains, nurses, and end-of-life doulas. To learn more about the EOL deck and to purchase this helpful conversation starter, visit thedeathdeck.com. This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being brought to you by GrandPad. This holiday season, give the gift of connection with GrandPad, the perfect way to keep your older loved ones close, even when you're far apart. GrandPad is the all-in-one tablet designed specifically for seniors, making it easier than ever to share holiday cheer across generations. With secure, simple video calling and photo sharing, you can virtually join in on decorating the tree or watch as your little ones open their presents, no matter the distance. Spread joy throughout the year with GrandPad's user-friendly interface, allowing seniors to enjoy music, games, photos, as well as emails from family. No need to worry about Wi-Fi setup. GrandPad comes with 4G LTE cellular service included. This Christmas, give the gift that keeps on giving, a world where no senior feels lonely or isolated. With GrandPad, you're not just giving a device, you're giving the warmth of family connection. Make this holiday season unforgettable. To learn more about GrandPad, visit grandpad.net/THOH or call 1-888-904-4723 today to order your GrandPad. It's more than a gift, it's a gateway to cherished family moments. GrandPad, bringing families together.
Okay, so I want to know, in all this caregiving experience, everything that you were doing with your dad during his illness, how did you take care of yourself while you were supporting him?
So I'm a big believer, and I tell this to all caregivers, you got to fill your cup because you cannot pour from an empty cup. So for me, what that looked like is I would go to the gym every morning. I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd check on my dad. If he was okay, then I'd go to the gym. I'd come back, check on him again. If he was still okay, I'd go get cleaned up for the day, and then I'd get him around for the day. And then I'd literally take my laptop and sit at the coffee table in my childhood home for the rest of the day. And so if he needed anything, I was right there. And, towards the end, if you saw pictures of me from back then, I look 10 years older than I do now. And it was so hard. I was sleeping with a baby monitor on a couch, just the room over, just in case he stirred or something like that, or he coughed, or if he needed something, and then I was right there. But going to the gym, I'm a big CrossFitter and strongman athlete. And I knew that if I could start off my day that way, that it was doing something for myself. It was giving myself a gift. It was filling my cup and giving me 1 hour of solace. And that if I had to give everything else the rest of the day, I still had something for myself. So I think that was the biggest thing for me, to start my day that way every single day. And then, give yourself grace. I always tell people, it's like, sometimes you just have to find the serenity when you can. And, the last year of my dad's life, we had my niece Josie, and man, go be around some puppies and kittens and babies.
That's the
it's
cure,
just,
isn't it?
Yeah, because a baby doesn't care. A baby's just being a baby, and a baby's being silly, blowing raspberries. They don't know that the grandpa just died. They're just like, hey, let's do this.
There's just joy.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah. And that's, that little girl helped us so much. And she'll, when my dad turned 70, I reached out to all his different circles. And so military, church, judges, community. And I said, I want, a letter, a thought, or a story about my dad. And so I put together a book for him for his 70th birthday, and I gave it to him. And my goal was 70 stories and, and entries, and I got over 100.
Oh,
And so I was able to give that to him. And then the last day of his life, I read to him from that. And,
beautiful.
just to help him have that review of his life, that I know is so important at the end. And then, so one of the things I did is I actually made a copy of the book for my niece. And now she has a little sister too, so they could learn about their grandfather and what an amazing man he was too.
What a wonderful legacy.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give if you were sitting with a caregiver who's got a person that they are caring for, who is on hospice, and they are recognizing that the death is coming very close? What advice would you give to them?
It's like I said before, fill your cup. I mean, that's so important. Even if whatever that looks like for you, maybe that's a morning meditation, maybe that's a walk around the block. I mean, just do something, one thing nice for yourself every single day. And try not to take things personal. I know that's hard. I mean, especially if you're dealing with somebody, say, that has a brain tumor, or,
Yeah.
or just on oxygen, and then their oxygen levels get low and they can get combative and irate, and and they can say things that they don't mean, and it's very upsetting. And if you can just remind yourself that's to try to not take those things personal. I know it's so much easier said than done, but also bring in your crew. I have great friendships all across the country, and I pulled those people in, and I was honest. And I also wrote a lot. I wrote a lot because that was very cathartic for me. And so I actually wrote some articles just like, hey, for those of you that may be in my shoes in the future, here's some of the things that I wish somebody had told me that I didn't know until I got here. And so those are the things, like like I say, get all the passwords. A power of attorney is no longer good when the person's passed, because
Right.
there's no power. And so those are things that I think people don't think about. My father was, like I said, he was an attorney and a judge, and he had set up hundreds of trusts for other people. But he always thought he had more time. So I will tell you that the biggest stressor for me was jumping through hoops to set up a trust before I knew he would be comfortable enough to trigger hospice.
Right.
And it was so apparent. I mean, and that, I will tell you, that was one of my biggest stressors, because every time we would go to talk about it, he'd fall asleep.
Mm.
And my dad had 8 bank accounts and 7 properties. So it was a little bit complex, but, and I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a town of 986 people. So everybody kind of knew who I was. So at least I could walk into the courthouse and be like, help me. I need deeds of the property and I don't know what to do. And then my dad was asleep when I left for the courthouse, and I came back, and I knew he might be mad at me for kind of going behind his back. And he said, where you been? And I said, I went to the courthouse. And he said, did you get the deeds of the property? And I was like, all of them. And he's like, that's my girl, because he knew, like
Yeah.
knew, because I knew him. And so, and that was the missing piece. So, getting all the information you can, but having those hard conversations, understanding what somebody wants, because you have those people that'll be like, oh, keep me alive no matter what. And, and that's not mine to judge. But it's just like, my dad was always very logical. And so that was something that was helpful for me. To tell you the truth, I know it'll be a much different experience when it comes to my mother. And I think I'll struggle a lot more with my mother because I'm such a logical person. So I might be trying to get advice from other people that have dealt with the emotional side of things more than the logical side of things. But, I think it's just, understanding what the kind of the subject matter is, so to speak, and then what's going to be the best course of action, but also understanding what that person wants. I mean, if they want to be kept alive with artificial means, like, what's the timeline there? If they want to make sure some money goes to a certain charity, what's that look like? because a lot of times, I mean, people don't have wills, or they just say, oh, it goes to the spouse, I'm not going to worry about it. But you still want to do your wishes. I mean, my father had a will and we had the trust and everything like that, but he also did a letter of intent. And he basically said what he wanted as wishes. Like, he talked about some certain charities. He talked about money that he wanted to go to certain people. And, so it was a great way to give. I mean, it was such a gift to us as his kids to have that roadmap. And it was very done, and so I will tell you, one of the first things I did that year after he passed, because I said to my husband, I said, the only thing that I want to make sure to get done is, I said, I want to set up our own trust. Because I said, I never want to feel that pressure or have anybody feel that pressure on my behalf ever. So it was something that, since I learned that from my experience with my dad, I was able to take it into my own life and say, okay, this is going to be a much easier time for the person that has to deal with it for me.
Yeah, there are a lot of lessons that come in a situation like that. The fact that you were open-minded enough to look at them and learn from them and carry that forward, that's just some great advice for other caregivers. Absolutely. So you have created something really special and meaningful in memory, really, in honor of your dad, Pancakes for Roger, which sounds crazy. It's a nonprofit. Tell me about the work that you're doing at Pancakes for Roger.
So just to give you kind of some context of the story behind Pancakes for Roger, as I told you about the cadence and the schedule my father and I had every morning. And so one morning after I'd done the gym stuff and I gotten cleaned up, I went to get him rallied around, and he wasn't in his hospital bed. And so my family's house goes in a circle, all the rooms. So I just kept going room to room. And then I kept not finding him. And then when I landed in the kitchen, he had a placemat set and he had set the table. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, what are you doing? And he said, well, I want pancakes for breakfast. And I looked at him and I was like, oh, Dad, I was like, there's nothing more in this world that I want to give you than pancakes for breakfast. But I'm like, we're on hospice. We have a DNR. And I said, if I give you pancakes and you choke, I said, we're probably done here. And I don't think we're quite ready to be done. And he said, oh, yes, I can. Matt said I could. And Matt's the nurse, the brother, and he wasn't there that morning. So I knew we were dealing with some confusion from oxygen deprivation. So I said, well, let me see what I can do. And so I heated up the tube feeding formula like I always did. And I put it on the table and he said, what's that? And I said, that's your syrup. And so his oxygen levels kind of started rallying around, and he smiled and he nodded and he said, okay. And so 3 weeks later, my dad ultimately passed away. And I took one day off of work when I came back to New York, because I just needed one day to shut out everything, like not look at emails, not look at, because everybody's just blowing you up. And it's like, and they're like, so sorry and stuff like that. And you just, God, I just didn't have the capacity. I was just like, just leave me be for just a day. Let me just have a day. And so my husband said, do you want to go have some pancakes for your dad? So we went to a diner, Bel Air Diner in Queens, New York. And my husband took a picture of me. And I shared the story on social media. And I said, you know what? I said, all of our lives can change in the blink of an eye. And we all have things to be thankful for. So if you're so inclined, go have some pancakes for Roger and be reminded of all the blessings you have in your life. And that was it. I was just sharing some of my sorrow, some of my heart, just being honest. And I didn't think it'd ever go anywhere. But then people started having pancakes and taking pictures and sending me pictures. And they said, I can't have pancakes and not think about your dad. And I can't have pancakes and not talk to my kids about military service or volunteering. And so what it ended up ultimately turning into was a fundraising effort for the University of Missouri School of Law Veterans Clinic that provides free legal services for veterans and their families, navigating the VA claims and appeals process, discharge upgrades and more. So my dad's birthday was February 22nd. So every February since he's passed, we use that as our pancake month. So it's Pancakes for Roger month. And so for every picture that we get on social media, pancake loving picture, using the hashtag Pancakes for Roger or tagging our social media accounts, we make a donation to the clinic in my father's honor. So it's, that's how it started. It was all my money. I was like, I don't need any money. Just have pancakes, share the picture, make sure it's public facing or I can't pull it. And that's where it kind of started. And then I had people that were after me for a long time to write a book. And when I publicly speak, I would always end like with non-solicited advice. And I always thought it'd be cool to start a book that way and give a quote from somebody and then talk about their life and then like how you can plug and play the information. So that's what I thought when I started out writing the book. And then my dad took over the whole thing. as the general normally did. But writing that book was probably the best gift I could have given myself after my father passed. Because, like I said, I stepped into a lot of his shoes. I went into work mode. My father, it was ultimately buried at Arlington, and that was a year later because Arlington has 30 to 40 funerals every single day. And so it takes that long because you still have some World War II guys, still have Korean guys, you in Vietnam, you got Desert Storm, you got current conflicts and things like that. And it's a lot. And so I did so much work because I actually had 4 hours of what I called family office time in my calendar every single week the first year my father passed, because I knew my mother was going to be getting mail from places and not know what to do. Because my mother, finding she's a wonderful woman, but she's not very business savvy. And there was a lot of things that it was just she was going through so much grief herself. And my dad had just kind of handled things. So I stepped in on there, and she knew that time was allocated to her every single week. And so I would call her, 2:00 on Tuesday or Thursday. And I would say, okay, let's do FaceTime. Well, show me the mail. And so she would hold things up. What do I do with this? What do I do with this? And so we would just kind of go through things. And so since I went into that mode, I didn't get a lot of the grieving time. And so by writing the book, I will tell you, every single week I wrote, I ugly cried. It was so cathartic for me. And because I was able to share the lessons that I got growing up with everybody else. And I was raised that if somebody gives you good advice, it is your duty to share it with somebody else. So the book is separated into 4 sections: self-love, family, and career. And I talk about my grief journey. I talk about being a caregiver. I talk about going from small town Missouri to big New York City. But just also some of the things that my dad taught us along the way. And so the book came out, and then December of last year, it officially became a nonprofit, because even though we've supported the Veterans Clinic every single year with the picture campaign, I mean, this past February, we got all 7 continents, we got all 50 states, and we got 29 additional countries. And so we were able to make a donation of over $10,000 to the Veterans Clinic this year. And but I'm like, there's more that we could do. And so, right now we're in the process of building an endowment, so that we'll be able to provide grants for veterans that want to do different type of service projects and help them connect with different things in their community. And we'll always support the Veterans Clinic every single February because it's a lot of fun. But I'm excited to see what the next is going to be. And so as you know, my husband and I are getting ready to move to New Hampshire. And so I'm super excited to have that be the new home for Pancakes for Roger. New Hampshire is a very, very, very much a veteran-friendly state. And so I'm excited to see what things come out of it, because I have aspirations for kind of like a soldier Shark Tank. I think that it could be pretty cool because, I started my first company at 26 years old, and if somebody had given me $5,000, that would have changed my life. And to just set up a website, get insurance, incorporation documents, get, QuickBooks set up. I mean, all those things you have to do that you're like, man, this is expensive, so
exactly.
So I think that there's going to be some cool things like that we're able to do. We had a couple of weightlifting competitions this year. We're going to have 2 in-person ones next year, and I think some virtual challenges. And then it'll be cool to see how everything kind of unfolds.
So how can my listeners connect with Pancakes for Roger, connect with you, see the work, maybe volunteer, donate? How can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm very Googleable. So if you do Susan L. Combs, you'll pretty much find me. But you can go to the website, pancakesforroger.org. And I will say, if you have a veteran that you want to honor, we do have a wall of honor, and we're happy to honor our veterans. So you can submit a picture, or you can submit a name. They can be alive or they can have passed, and we're happy to honor them that way too. So we also like to share impact stories of veterans. So if you have a veteran that that is doing good in the world, we'd love to hear about it, and share their story on social media as well.
Awesome. Where can people buy your book?
Easiest way is just go to Amazon. You can buy it that way. I will say the audiobook is me talking. So if you love my lovely voice, I will tell you that's a fun thing to do in a studio is read your own book. I will tell you it's it's harder than it sounds, because they're your stories. So it's like, so, you never tell the same story twice, the story twice the same way. And so you always want to kind of like elaborate and make a little more colorful language, but not when you're reading a book for audiobook. It has to be word for word exactly how it is. But that was a lot of fun. So yeah, Amazon's probably the easiest way to find it.
Awesome. I'll have links to everything in the show notes so my listeners can find you. Susan, you are awesome. Thank you for your story. And I will tell you that you said you got things right as a caregiver because you had a good dad.
Yeah.
What I would tell you is I think you were a good caregiver because Roger had a good daughter.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much for being with me here today and for sharing your story.
Thanks for having me, Helen.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.